How are today's cruise ships different from those of Titanic's day? Sure, we all know they're now required to carry more lifeboats, but that isn't exactly what makes them the life of the party. Let's start with the size. Everyone knows that the Titanic was the largest ship of its time. But how big was it exactly? The Titanic stretched 882 feet from bow to stern and had a beam or width of 92 feet. The ship's 9 decks rose to an impressive 175 feet, making it about the height of an 11-story building. Designed to carry more than 2,400 passengers and almost 900 crew members, the Titanic had certainly earned its name. Even had it managed to avoid the iceberg, the Titanic wouldn't have held on to its title for very long. The SS Imperator would steal its crown a year later when it undertook his maiden voyage in 1913. That's right, his. Even though most ships are referred to with female pronouns, Kaiser Wilhelm II specifically requested the ship be considered a male. It's not entirely clear why, but one possibility might be grammar, since Imperator, meaning emperor, is an exclusively male title in German. As the decades passed, ships only got bigger and bigger as countries and companies competed for the crown. As of 2019, the largest cruise ship in the world is the Symphony of the Seas, which is operated by Royal Caribbean. The Symphony dwarfs Titanic in every way. 1,184 feet across and 215 feet wide, her 18 decks are double the Titanic's height and provide spacious accommodations for well over 5,000 passengers. And since we're on the subject of accommodations, it might be time to talk about the different purposes these two ships were created for. The Symphony of the Seas is a cruise ship, not an ocean liner like the Titanic and Imperator. Think of it as the difference between a city bus and a tour bus. You board a cruise ship to have fun, and an ocean liner when you need to get somewhere. The Titanic was constructed in Belfast Harbor on a special slipway built specifically to accommodate its unprecedented bulk. Above the dry dock was a massive steel structure known as the Errol Gantry. This 225-foot-tall gantry utilized numerous cranes for lifting the large plates into a position where they then could be riveted into place. Many folks don't realize that there were special green frogs up on the gantry whose purpose was to inspire the workers to rivet. Nah, I made that part up. Could you tell? The hull of the Titanic was made up of thousands of these overlapping plates, with the lower hull consisting of 2 layers. This was done to protect the Titanic from damage caused by scraping against the seabed. Unfortunately, the damage from the iceberg was just below the waterline, where there was only 1 layer of plating between the ocean and the ship's interior. Titanic's primary safety feature was the 16 watertight compartments making up the lower decks. The ship was designed to stay afloat with 4 of these compartments completely flooded. Again, unfortunately, the iceberg opened a long gash across 5 of them. The chambers also failed to extend all the way to the top of the hull. Once the water reached the top of the 5 breached compartments, it quickly overflowed and spilled into the others, dragging the ship down at an even greater speed. Ships of today are still made of steel, but advancements in smelting and metallurgy have resulted in hulls stronger and less brittle than were possible 100 years ago. Aluminum is also widely used to reduce the ship's weight. This allows the vessels to achieve their towering height while still maintaining a low center of gravity, thanks to the heavy engines and fuel tanks at the bottom of the hull. The reduced weight also means lower emissions. Speaking of the engines, modern cruise ships run primarily on either diesel, natural gas, or some combination of the two. The vessels that use both often employ diesel engines for propulsion and natural gas to drive the motors that produce electricity. This is a far cry from ships of the Titanic's era, which used coal furnaces to boil the water powering its steam engines. Modern ships may not be emission-free, but it's a lot better than belching clouds of ash and smoke. Construction techniques have also changed over the years, although that's no surprise considering how radically the ships themselves have transformed. Instead of only having a few large internal compartments, the internal structure of modern cruise ships is a vast network of steel webs radiating inward from the hull, with every fourth web supporting a massive wall of steel. The girders are concealed within the walls of the ship and serve as the vessel's primary load-bearing structure. Remember, the Titanic didn't sink the moment it made contact with the ice. It actually took a full 2 hours and 40 minutes to go under. While that would give the crew more time to evacuate the passengers, the danger wasn't apparent the whole time. When the order was delivered to don their life jackets, many treated it as a joke. When it came time to board the lifeboats, many passengers were reluctant, believing themselves safer on the big warm ship than the tiny open boats. That was part of the reason the first boats out were among the emptiest. If people were that reluctant to board escape craft until it was almost too late, how were the crew going to convince them to clamber atop a freezing lump of ice? People wouldn't start changing their tune until much later, once the ship began to visibly tilt. Once that happens, it would be chaos as people crowd the gangplank and struggle to cross the surface of the iceberg. Making matters worse is that if too many people tried to cross the plank at once, it could end up snapping. This wouldn't only throw everyone into the freezing water, but they'd also risk being crushed between the iceberg and the hull of the ship. The lifeboats could be used to help with the evacuation, but presented their own problems. If the people who took the gangplank would have trouble moving across the berg, scaling the slopes from the surface of the water would be even more difficult. And frankly, if you were on a lifeboat, would you want to trade it for a giant hunk of ice? These are all big problems that would have made evacuating to the iceberg unfeasible. And we haven't even gotten to the biggest one on the list – reaching it. Didn't see that one coming, did you? At first, this might seem strange. How can you not be close enough to the thing you just crashed into? That's like the ultimate level of proximity. Well, the Titanic didn't exactly grind to a halt the moment it hit the iceberg. As you might have guessed, the ship's helmsman had been trying to steer away from the ice before the collision. Instead of ramming into the iceberg head-on, the Titanic merely grazed its side, swapping paint in history's worst fender bender. Ironically, they might have been better off with a front-on collision. While there would have still been flooding on the lower decks, the water would have been confined to only a few of the compartments. The Titanic was designed to stay afloat with up to 4 of the 16 watertight compartments flooded. The glancing blow caused a breach in 6, which astute viewers will notice as being 2 more than the maximum number. The unsinkable Molly Brown is one of the most popular and liked characters in the 1964 movie and earlier Broadway musical, based on the great ship's unlucky maiden voyage. But this woman wasn't just thought up by some Hollywood screenwriter, she was a real passenger. Margaret Brown was known even before the Titanic for being one of the first women in the U.S. to run for office, 8 years before women could even vote. She was in London when she found out that her grandson was sick, so she headed to New York immediately. Because this decision was so last-minute, very few people knew that she was on board the Titanic. Once the ship struck the iceberg, Mrs. Brown selflessly helped other passengers into the lifeboats until getting into one herself. After being rescued by the RMS Carpathia, she organized a committee with other first-class survivors and Carpathia passengers. The committee would raise money and provide counseling for the more destitute people that lived through the tragedy. Upon arriving in New York, she wouldn't leave the rescue ship until she made sure that every survivor received medical attention and found their families. Mrs. Brown was given a medal for her goodwill in helping the Titanic survivors. She was also later awarded the French Legion of Honor for her charitable work rebuilding France and helping soldiers. A truly extraordinary woman. Speaking of incredible women, throughout her career working at sea, Miss Violet Constance Jessup survived not 1 but 3 shipwrecks, the Titanic included. She started out as a stewardess on board the Olympic, which crashed in 1911. Just 7 months later, she survived the Titanic, and then went on to serve as a nurse for the British Red Cross HMHS Britannic. This ship sank from an explosion, but Violet yet again came out of it and kept working at sea. This adventurous spirit finally settled down in Great Ashfield, England. Just like Margaret Brown, Violet was often jokingly called Miss Unsinkable. There's definitely truth to that. The actress Dorothy Gibson, most famous for her role in the 1912 movie Saved from the Titanic, was actually one of the survivors of the catastrophe. She and her mother were coming back to the U.S. on board the Titanic after vacationing in Europe. The two had been playing bridge with some friends when they escaped together in the half-empty lifeboat No. 7, but nearly sank again when one of the other survivors noticed a hole in the boat. Luckily, they were able to plug it up with some clothes. Not long after Gibson arrived in New York aboard the Carpathia, her agent convinced her to star in a movie about the Titanic sinking. She wrote the script herself and wore the same clothes in the movie that she did on the night of the disaster. The film came out just a month after the tragedy. Dorothy later gave up her acting career to work in the Metropolitan Opera. She spent her last years in Paris. What a life! If you're interested in seeing it before it disappears, the time is now. In 100 years, the site of the Titanic might have just a few remnants strewn out on the ocean floor. Just make sure you have a big wad of cash, because the experience isn't cheap. A trip to the site will cost you over $105,000 per person. If the price makes you think twice. An interesting point is that after taking inflation into consideration, the price is what some passengers in first class would have paid to board the ship back in the day. The current price is equivalent to $4,350 in 1912. Price notwithstanding, seeing the Titanic's wreck is the experience of a lifetime. If the price is too hefty for your taste, you can go to Ireland's Titanic Museum, or you can wait a few years and head to the Sichuan province in China, where a life-size replica of the Titanic is being constructed. The replica of the Titanic will also include a theme park. It's a multi-million-dollar project that will allow you to walk the same hallways, look at the lavish accommodations, and enjoy the spectacular view from the top of the ship, just like the original Titanic passengers did. The replica was supposed to be completed in 2017, but the construction is far from over. If you want a more low-key approach, you can always head to Las Vegas, low-key, to see some of the Titanic's artifacts. You can also just cozy up on your couch with a big box of tissues and watch the movie for the bazillionth time. People today mock how the Titanic was advertised as unsinkable, but back then, it barely even counted as a boast. Regardless of the reason, Captain Smith chose to continue ahead at full speed. He did have the presence of mind to order the Titanic's lookouts to watch for ice, but due to a clerical error, they were never given binoculars. The lack of lifeboats was also due to a misunderstanding of how any potential collisions would play out, and not just because they would be redundant on an invincible ship. At the time, it was generally accepted that if a ship ever needed to be abandoned, the passengers and crew would be picked up by another vessel in the same area. No one had ever anticipated the need to evacuate everyone on board onto lifeboats. That also helps to explain why the evacuation was so disorganized, with many boats leaving only partially full. While that's a pretty big oversight, the original plan could have worked if someone had picked up their distress call in time. You see, by 1912, ships weren't yet required to have someone operating the radio 24/7. This meant that the radio operator of the SS Californian, the nearest ship, and the one Titanic's operator had told to shut up, was asleep when the distress calls went out. Making matters worse was the fact that the Titanic's radio operator reported the wrong coordinates in his SOS. This meant that even the ships that received the call had trouble finding where the Titanic had gone down. So those were the main problems facing the Titanic on that fateful night: overconfidence, poor communication, insufficient lifeboats, and the inability of rescuers to find her. Now that we've established all that, it's time to answer our main question. What if the Titanic disaster happened today? After the Titanic sank, many new procedures were established with the hope of preventing similar disasters. One of the first was the establishment of regular ice patrols in that region of the North Atlantic. In the early days, this meant guys with binoculars freezing their noses off in boats and planes. But fortunately, today is not 100 years ago. Another reason today is better than a century ago is that our iceberg detection has gotten a lot more sophisticated. The United States Coast Guard and Canadian Ice Service regularly patrol the area with radar-equipped HC-130 aircraft to scan for any icebergs coming too close to major shipping routes. With the added assistance of global positioning satellites and reports from passing ships, the two agencies can provide daily updates on the position of icebergs in the North Atlantic. Individual vessels also have a much easier time spotting icebergs in their vicinity, thanks to technologies such as radar and sonar becoming commonplace. These advancements have done a great deal to make sea travel a lot safer, but they aren't foolproof. Accidents can still happen, so it's a good thing large vessels are now required to carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board, and the crews receive training in proper evacuation procedures. Modern ships are also required to have a radio operator on duty at all times. That's good for several reasons, one of them being that no one wants to be the guy who slept through a crisis. The captain of the Californian got fired over missing the Titanic's call, and he hadn't even been breaking any rules. Emergency radio calls have been standardized to a greater extent than they were in 1912. Additionally, GPS tracking means that if a ship needs help, responders will know precisely where the trouble is going down. Pardon the pun. Rescue efforts are also much more coordinated than they would have been in the early 20th century. The Coast Guard maintains a variety of emergency response vehicles, ranging from small boats and helicopters to large ships and planes. They're also better able to coordinate with and dispatch help from other civilian and military traffic in the area.